Now, what I wanted to talk about tonight was actually it's a beautiful narration that compares the validity and the virtue of tafakkur, of contemplation, to the virtue of qiyamul layl, the virtue of praying at night, and how these concepts actually are married within the books of the Salaf, within the narrations of the pious predecessors. And it starts with a narration from Aoun ibn Abdullah, rahimahullah ta'ala. He said, I asked Darda, radiyallahu ta'ala anha, about Abu Darda, radiyallahu anhu. And I wanted to know what his best form of ibadah was, what his best form of worship was. Now, Abu Darda, obviously, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, was one of the muftis of the companions, one of the most knowledgeable of the companions, and distinguished with his ibadah and admired by the tabi'een, admired by the next generation for the example that he left behind in that regard. And of course, his wife, Darda as-Sughra, is a scholar in her own right that was sought out and asked many times and would often relay things on behalf of her husband. So Aoun ibn Abdullah is asking Darda what was his best ibadah. And particularly, by the way, there are two narrations. أي عبادة أبي الدرداء كانت أكثر, and in one narration, أفضل. So which of the acts of worship of Abu Darda radiyallahu ta'ala anhu were most, or which of them were the best? So what is his most virtuous and most distinctive form of worship, and what is his most frequent form of worship? أكثر. And she said that what distinguished him, قالت التفكر والاعتبار, to remember, contemplate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, التفكر, and i'tibar, to take into account, to reflect and to take into account. Both of them are within the same domain of contemplation, التفكر والاعتبار. And she goes on to say that Abu Darda radiyallahu ta'ala anhu said, تفكر ساعة خير من قيام ليلة, to remember Allah for an hour, and particularly here to contemplate for an hour. To contemplate for an hour is better than praying all night. To contemplate for an hour is better than praying all night. This is also something, by the way, that has been narrated on behalf of Hasan al-Basri, rahimahullah ta'ala. He said, تفكر ساعة خير من قيام ليلة, that to remember Allah, I keep on saying to remember Allah because I'll talk about what tafakkur means in this context, but to contemplate for an hour is better than an entire night of prayer. Now, what is tafakkur and how is it related to qiyamul layl? And what is al-i'tibar? This is another word that often does not get introduced. You hear the words tafakkur and you hear tadabbur, which are contemplation and reflection. I'tibar, which is to consider, to take into account something, is a word that's often not used when we're talking about this blessed practice. So let's first talk about the domain as a whole, inshallah ta'ala. You know, clearing your head, if you go out in nature and you don't do anything, you don't say anything, you just look around and you just take it all in, quiet everything, then that in and of itself is a means of really opening up the pathways in your heart and in your thoughts so that you can remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala properly, so that you can consider the greatness of Allah and the greatness of your purpose living in accordance with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed and what comes next after this life, the true meaning of this life and what comes in the hereafter, and so on and so forth. You know, that practice of taking time out is incredibly not just therapeutic, but beneficial to your iman. And it's usually just talked about in the capacity of how therapeutic it is. And it is therapeutic to get time out, to breathe fresh air. But it's also extremely beneficial to your iman, beneficial to your faith. And it's increasingly become difficult to do that because of the devices that we have now that don't allow us to ever disconnect. And you have to disconnect from the world to connect with Allah. You know, sometimes you have to take those breaks. So if you have your phone with you, if you have your laptop with you, wherever you are, it is so hard to cut off everything for an hour to just remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to think about Him.